The glass facade of the Bel-Air penthouse was glittering expanse of Los Angeles. Mid-morning sunlight hit the titanium bezel of his platinum automatic watch, catching his eye as he gave the strap one last, ritualistic adjustment. Control was Julian's native language, and the watch was his metronome. At 55, the silver streaks in his dark, impeccably styled hair made him look less like a tech founder and more like a statesman. Exactly the carefully curated image he needed. He was wearing his armor today, a tailored charcoal suit, pressed into submission, just like the markets he influenced. But his posture, usually ramrod straight, held a faint, almost invisible tension. He was waiting for the inevitable. The phone buzzed, and Dr. Lena Scott's name flashed across the screen. Julian answered with practiced smoothness. "Lena, you have the date." Dr. Scott, his family law counsel, was the only person Julian allowed to speak to him without a filter. Her voice, calm and strategically measured, came through the secure line. The judge signed the order. "We're set for a closed-door review next Tuesday. The core issue, Julian, is the status quo. Anya is 22, but since her mother passed, the trust terms are clear. You have to demonstrate emotional engagement, not just financial support. They're questioning your ability to foster her well-being outside of a corporate context." The words emotional engagement hit him like a physical blow. He turned, looking out at the city he'd built his fortune in, a landscape of infinite possibility, none of which seemed to extend to his own daughter. Anya Vance, his brilliant, rebellious daughter with the jet black hair and the hidden streak of sapphire blue. He hadn't truly seen her, in 6 months, not since that explosive argument in her studio. He'd walked in and seen the visceral, messy canvases, guts and color, totally unmarketable. He'd seen a path to ruin, and he'd offered to buy her a gallery, a corporate sponsorship, a safe, clean legacy. She had thrown a paint-splattered palette knife at the wall and screamed that he couldn't buy her soul. That was the moment. The memory of her silver nose ring flashing under the harsh studio lights, her eyes blazing with a defiance he recognized from his own youth, was a fresh, searing burn. "I fund her foundation. I bought the downtown studio space she insisted on," Julian argued, the tension making his voice too sharp. He looked down at his hand, the one wearing the watch, the hand that had signed countless 9-figure deals, now feeling clumsy and useless. "What do they want? A father-daughter picnic? A shared passion project?" "They want proof you're not just a checkbook," Dr. Scott replied, cutting straight through his denial. "The court needs to see you're willing to meet her where she is. The trust is clear. If she can prove you're actively hindering her legitimate professional development or psychological health, she can petition to emancipate the remaining $400 million early. This isn't about the money, Julian. It's about control. And right now, she's winning the emotional narrative. You need to do something vulnerable. Something public, perhaps, that shows you respect her work. Something that goes against the Vance brand of perfect, pragmatic success." Julian walked across the polished marble floor. His reflection was a man in an exquisite prison. Vulnerable, public. He hated both. But Lena was right. Losing the control over Anya's inheritance meant losing the last vestige of influence he had over her life. He stopped at the floor-to-ceiling window, the light blinding. He had to show her he wasn't just Julian Vance, CEO. He had to make a move she wouldn't expect, a move that would prove he was listening, even if it cost him his meticulously maintained reputation. "The foundation has an unscheduled board meeting next week," he said slowly, the idea forming, terrifying and brilliant. "We're going to use the endowment to acquire a piece of art." He paused, his gaze locked on the city below. "But not just any piece. I want you to locate the most emotionally explosive, most unmarketable piece Anya has ever created. I'm going to put it on the company's public digital billboard on Sunset Boulevard." A silence hung on the line, pregnant with consequence. He was trading a fraction of his corporate prestige for one chance at his daughter's attention. Dr. Lena Scott was not accustomed to navigating the darker, grittier corners of the art world, but Julian's directive was absolute. She tasked her team with a near-impossible excavation, finding the ghost of a painting. Anya, The 22-year-old artist with the long jet black hair and the defiant sapphire streak was fiercely private, especially about the work she deemed sacred. But they found it, an aggressively titled piece called The Empty Chair, created in the immediate aftermath of her mother's terminal diagnosis. The images her team sent back showed not a typical painting, but a raw, multimedia installation, a charred wooden chair isolated in a cold, white space, draped with fragmented letters, and smeared with a haunting mix of oil paint and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. It was a scream on canvas. Lena was back at the Omnitech Tower, confronting Julian in his massive, charcoal gray office. She was wearing a professional slate blue dress, her short, elegant natural curls framing a face etched with genuine concern. "Julian," she started, laying a glossy printout of the installation on his sleek, minimalist desk. "Look at this. This isn't just art, it's a confession. The court will see the pain. The public will see a scandal. This isn't a landscape. It's raw grief, focused entirely on the emotional absence she associates with you and your work during her mother's illness." She tapped the printout. "We're not just putting up a painting. We're putting up the most vulnerable moment of her life on a 40-foot screen. This is a massive risk to your reputation, to Omnitech stock, to the whole Vance brand of controlled perfection." Julian Vance, in his crisp navy suit, stared down at the image. He saw the chair. He saw the black void where a person should be. He remembered the hospital calls he'd missed, the critical board meeting he hadn't canceled. He saw the evidence of his own failure. The urge to pull the plug, to revert to a safe, controlled strategy, a donation, a scholarship, was overwhelming. His platinum automatic watch felt suddenly heavy, a symbol of the time he'd bought instead of spent. Then his assistant's tablet chimed. A news aggregation alert. Julian glanced at the screen. Anya Vance, the young artist, had posted a cryptic message to her 200,000 followers. "Beware the wolves who claim to admire the work only after they fail to control the artist. Appropriation is the final violence." She hadn't named him, but the timing was a needle-sharp warning. She was waiting for him to make a predictable corporate move. "She knows I'm making a play," Julian muttered, picking up the printout, his grip tightening. "This isn't about me proving I'm a good father for a judge, Lena. This is about proving to her that I'm willing to lose something valuable, my image, my pride, to show I finally see her pain, not just her potential. If I put up a safe piece, she'll see the manipulation, and I lose everything. If I put up the empty chair, it's a surrender. It's me saying, I acknowledge the emptiness I created." Lena hesitated, admiring his sudden, reckless courage, even as she dreaded the legal fallout. "It will be chaos, Julian. The press will dissect every single brushstroke." "Let them," Julian said, his eyes finally lifting from the image to meet hers, a flicker of genuine, unmasked pain visible on his mid-50s face. He made a small motion with his hand, a finality in the gesture. "Send the full resolution file, encrypted, directly to the Sunset team. Tell them to schedule the display for peak traffic, starting tonight. No watermarks. No corporate branding. Just the art. We're committed now. There is no going back." A moment later, a silent data transfer bar on his screen completed its journey. The raw, emotional core of his daughter's pain was now traveling through fiber optic cables to a massive, public digital canvas, destined to be seen by millions. Julian waited for a sense of relief, but only a deep, sickening dread settled in his chest. What if this public apology only ignited a deeper rage in her? Dusk was settling over Hollywood, the notorious rush hour crawl a slow river of red taillights on Sunset Boulevard. Suddenly, the entire energy of the strip seemed to redirect toward the massive, multi-story digital billboard dominating the skyline, the flagship display for Omnitech, usually reserved for dazzling, clean ads touting the future of connectivity. But tonight, there was no logo, no slogan, only a searing, monumental image, Anya Vance's The Empty Chair. The charred wood, the desperate, fragmented letters, and the ugly, truth-telling smear of dark paint were projected in terrifying, beautiful high definition. It stopped traffic. People gasped, pointed, and immediately pulled out phones to film. A wave of confusion and morbid fascination rippled through the city. Was this a protest? A bizarre marketing campaign? Miles away, Julian Vance sat in his office, the lights low, watching the live, geotagged social media feed explode. His reputation manager was flooding his secure line with panic alerts. The stock was already showing a fractional dip. The comments were brutal. Vance is finally showing his true colors, buying his daughter's trauma. Billionaire guilt looks expensive. What is this grotesque nonsense? His mid-50s face, usually so composed, was pale. He was gambling his carefully constructed image on a single, desperate message of empathy. He ran a hand over his silver-streaked hair, the pressure suffocating. He didn't care about the stock. He needed to know if the message had pierced through the corporate noise and reached Anya. Meanwhile, Anya was exactly where she preferred to be, anonymous. She was driving her beat-up, dark green vintage truck through a side street near Silver Lake, wearing her usual armor of an oversized black hoodie and ripped jeans. Her long jet black hair pulled back messily. She was listening to a noisy punk playlist, trying to drown out the low-grade anxiety of her life. She took a familiar turn, and then the light hit her. It wasn't just the size, it was the sheer audacity. There, on the screen her father's company owned, was the rawest piece of her soul. The piece she'd painted when she was 18, fueled by the agonizing realization that no amount of money could save her mother or fill the gaping holes of her father's constant absence. She slammed on the brakes, the truck tires squealing faintly. Her silver nose ring flashed as she stared up. For a moment, the ingrained anger, the suspicion that this was a hyper-calculated PR stunt, took hold. He's trying to sanitize it, to own it. But as she looked closer, she noticed the stark truth. There was no Omnitech logo, no caption, no attempt to explain or commercialize. It was just the art, and by extension, just her pain, amplified for the entire city to witness. It was the opposite of sanitization. It was an exposure he'd paid for with his own reputation. A single, hot tear tracked down her cheek, a betrayal of the defiance she carefully maintained. She didn't cry. Not in public. She pulled the brim of her hoodie down. This wasn't a victory. It was a chess move he'd finally made correctly, and it unsettled her profoundly. He'd acknowledged the emptiness. He'd admitted to the world that his fortune hadn't insulated him from the very human tragedy he had caused. Anya sat there for a long moment, the blaring horns of rush hour fading into a distant hum as she processed the impossible sacrifice. Then, her eyes narrowing again, she shifted the stick into gear. She wasn't going home. She was driving across town to the only place he'd never followed her, her mother's secluded, abandoned art cottage near Malibu. She needed to find the one thing he couldn't buy. The morning after the billboard reveal was a professional catastrophe. Julian Vance, looking exhausted but determined in a fresh navy suit, took the emergency board call standing stiffly in his penthouse. The voices of his partners were clipped and furious. They had suffered the steepest single-day stock dip in Omnitech history outside of a financial crash. His board chair delivered the final ultimatum. Julian, you have 5 days to stabilize the market and resolve this personal situation, or we force a vote on your operational control. This spectacle is untenable. Julian barely heard them. His attention was fixed on the screen. Anya's social media was silent. Her apartment was empty. The public apology had landed, but the recipient had vanished. Dr. Lena Scott arrived, bypassing Julian's assistance. Her professional camel dress offered a warmer tone than the cold steel of the office. She saw the defeat in his mid-50s face. You did what you had to do for the court. You showed vulnerability. Now we prepare for the hearing, she said, her voice steady. But before that, you have to find her. The court will see her absence as proof of your emotional alienation. You need to show that you are capable of a father's intuition, not just a CEO's tracking metrics. Think like a father, not a founder. Where would she go to feel safe, to be close to her mother? Julian closed his eyes, forcing his mind away from spreadsheets and into the past. The cottage. Her mother's art retreat in Malibu. Meanwhile, Anya's vintage truck rattled to a stop outside a secluded, overgrown cottage nestled into the Malibu hills. her mother's quiet refuge, abandoned since her death. Anya, in her dark, textured clothing and silver crescent moon necklace, pushed open the sticky door. The air inside smelled of sea salt, old canvas, and bittersweet memory. She walked straight to a dusty, tucked-away closet, pulling down a small, unremarkable wooden box. This was the sanctuary her mother had used when Julian was obsessed with his first IPO. Inside, beneath a handful of dried paint tubes, were two items. First, a crinkled, faded drawing, a stick figure portrait of a smiling young mother and a child, labeled simply, "Our Hideout." Anya held it, her eyes, usually so defiant, softening with sorrow. The second item was a small, folded piece of thick cardstock, a thank you note her mother had written to a doctor years ago. But the back was covered in her mother's elegant handwriting, deliberately coded, using botanical terms she and Anya had shared. Anya carefully deciphered the last few lines, her fingers tracing the ink. "He is standing, Anya, but his root is severed. He built the wall of glass around us not to keep us out, but to hold himself in. He grieves the loss of art more than he grieves the loss of us." Anya stopped breathing. He grieves the loss of art. She had always believed her father's only regret was financial, his only love control. But the note, a final message from the one person who truly knew Julian, suggested a profound, secret vulnerability. Her father hadn't missed the funeral because of a board meeting. He had missed it because he was hiding. He was grieving something deeper than his marriage. The note didn't absolve Julian's absence, but it complicated it, replacing simple malice with hidden, overwhelming pain. The image of the empty chair on the billboard, his reputation sacrificed, suddenly took on a terrifying new context. He hadn't been buying her pain. He had been confessing his own. The drive from Bel-Air to Malibu was normally just traffic and wasted time for Julian Vance. Today, navigating his black, silent SUV along the winding coastal roads, it was a confessional. He wore a charcoal suit, still impeccable, but his guard was finally dropping. His entire career, Omnitech, the billions, the impenetrable control, was built on a lie of pragmatic perfection. The truth, the one his late wife had encoded in that note, was that Julian Vance wasn't just a billionaire. He was a failed artist. He'd been an oil painter in his 20s, just as passionate, just as messy as Anya. When his art failed to sell, when the poverty became unbearable and his father's critique too harsh, he'd chosen the only path guaranteed to be safe and profitable: technology. He hadn't given up art, he had killed it, and then spent the next 3 decades burying the body under layers of success and wealth. The grief wasn't for his wife's illness. It was for the artist he had sacrificed, which she, his wife, had recognized and protected. He saw Anya's dark green vintage truck parked haphazardly near the overgrown porch of the cottage. His heart seized. He stopped his SUV several yards down the road and cut the engine, the silence amplifying the ocean waves. He saw her shadow move behind the dusty window. He wanted to rush in, but he knew any show of force would send her running. He had to show her the truth, the core wound he had never let anyone see, the reason he had tried so desperately to steer her away from art, fear of her failure mirroring his own. Inside, Anya was still sitting on the floor, the decoded note clenched in her hand. Her jet-black hair fell around her face, concealing the tears. He built the wall of glass to hold himself in. The picture of her father as a terrified, self-imprisoned man was profoundly destabilizing. Her anger was deflating, replaced by a devastating empathy. She looked up, and through the dust, she saw the faint outline of her father's figure, hesitating outside the window. He looked small, lost, and utterly without his usual corporate armor. Julian walked slowly toward the porch. He didn't knock. He just pushed the creaking door open, his gaze sweeping over the familiar, dusty interior. He saw the empty box, the faded drawing. He looked at Anya, their eyes meeting for the first time since the billboard went up. Hers were filled with knowledge and pain, his with raw apology. Neither spoke. Julian turned away, walking past her, deeper into the cottage. He ran his hand across a specific section of the western wall, a seam concealed by decades of chipped paint and shadow. His wife had designed this room, this wall. He pushed against a specific knot in the wood paneling, and with a low click, a narrow section of the wall swung inward, revealing a small, dark, dust-covered vault. He reached inside, pulling out one object, a large, heavy canvas, covered tightly in a linen cloth and tied with old, faded rope. This was the only piece of art he hadn't destroyed. The last painting of the artist Julian Vance. He placed the canvas on the easel, his hands, the hands that controlled billions, trembling slightly. He looked at his daughter, who was watching him with wide, cautious eyes. He pulled the cloth away, revealing the unfinished, emotionally charged canvas, a self-portrait of a young man, desperate and trapped, painted with a fury and vulnerability that was utterly unrecognizable from the man in the tailored suit. The silence in the Malibu cottage was broken only by the sound of waves outside and the ragged breathing of a man who hadn't truly breathed in decades. Julian Vance, the billionaire, stood before the canvas, exposed. He looked at the younger man in the paint, the furious, hopeful eyes, and then at his daughter. This was my empty chair, Anya. Not an installation, but a self-portrait. I was 27. My wife, your mother, told me it was my best work. The last piece before I took the seed money from my father and filed the papers for Omnitech. I built a glass empire on a foundation of creative failure. I killed the artist to save the man from poverty and shame. His mid-50s face was stripped bare of all polish, the raw emotion a startling contrast to his tailored charcoal suit. Anya, who had been bracing for a new layer of control or a fresh negotiation, felt the full weight of her mother's coded note. He grieves the loss of art more than he grieves the loss of us. Her fierce anger dissolved into deep, aching understanding. The hostility she'd interpreted as contempt for her profession was actually a desperate plea for her to be careful, fueled by his own traumatic failure. He hadn't been trying to buy her art. He had been trying to buy her safety. She stood and walked slowly toward him, her long jet-black hair falling across her shoulder, revealing the shimmer of her silver crescent moon necklace. "The billboard," she said, her voice barely a whisper, pointing a trembling finger toward the enormous confession that had briefly broken his company. "That was your way of telling me this, wasn't it? You didn't buy my trauma. You confessed to yours. You put your failure up for everyone to see." Julian nodded, unable to speak, the shame and relief warring in his chest. "I saw your painting, The Empty Chair. I didn't see an asset to acquire, Anya. I saw my consequence. And I knew the only thing that would make you pause, the only currency you would believe, was if I sacrificed the one thing I still loved more than anything else, my public image. It was an apology not just for missing your life, but for forcing you onto a path I knew was spiritually fatal." He finally met her eyes. The gulf of years and misunderstandings briefly spanned. The silence that followed wasn't an absence of words, but a profound, shared acknowledgement of the wounds they both carried. They stood, the broken father, the heartbroken daughter, two opposing forces finally recognizing their shared gravity. There were no grand declarations, no embraces, just a shift in the air, a mutual, fragile peace. Julian then reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a single, folded legal document. "The court hearing is tomorrow. We can still fight it, or you can have the independence you deserve." He held out the paper. "This cottage. It was your mother's. She signed the deed over to the Vance Family Foundation years ago. I'm signing it over to you now, effective immediately, outside of the trust. Complete ownership. Your root, Anya, is not in my empire. It's here." He looked at the self-portrait. "And this. Take it. Finish it or burn it. Just don't let my fear become yours." Anya took the deed and the canvas with hands that no longer shook. The money was irrelevant now. He had given her autonomy, space, and most crucially, the emotional validation she had been starved of. The most powerful billionaire in the country had just surrendered his last remaining control for one single chance at being a father. Her defiance was replaced by a quiet, fierce determination. She had her space, her mother's secret, and her father's forgotten dream. She would go to the hearing tomorrow, but the fight was already over. Thanks for watching. More stories are coming soon.